Margaret Winters felt the weight of every stare like a physical blow as she stood frozen behind the bakery counter. The local newspaper lay spread open before her, its ink still fresh enough to smudge beneath her trembling fingers. The review was brutal, not of her pastries, which even the critic had begrudgingly praised, but of her. "One wonders," the final paragraph read, "about the background of someone who appears in our town with no history and sets up shop with such remarkable efficiency. In these uncertain times, do we truly know who is feeding our children?" The wall clock above the bread rack ticked loudly in the silence, each click like a tiny hammer against her composure. 6:47 in the morning, and already her carefully constructed world was beginning to crumble. "Mrs. Winters?" A young mother with a toddler on her hip was watching her, concern etched across her features. "Are you all right?" Margaret straightened her blue apron, forcing her lips into what she hoped resembled a smile. "Yes, of course. Just a bit of nonsense in the paper. Now what can I get for you today?" The woman hesitated, glancing down at the newspaper. "Actually, I think we'll try the new place by the school today." She backed away, pulling her child closer, as though Margaret might somehow contaminate them with whatever suspicion the article had planted. By noon, the pattern was established. Regular customers who had praised her cinnamon rolls and sourdough for the past 3 years now found reasons to hurry past her storefront, averting their eyes when she looked out the window. The fresh-baked scent of rain-soaked earth, her special technique of misting the bread crusts with mineral water before baking, hung heavy in the empty shop, a sensory reminder of the success she was watching slip away. The clock ticked on relentlessly. 12:38. Alone during the lunch hour for the first time since opening day, Margaret retreated to her small office behind the kitchen. She slumped into her chair, the springs protesting with a metallic groan. From her desk drawer, she withdrew a worn, leather-bound recipe book, her grandmother's, or so she told anyone who asked. As she flipped through its pages, a folded slip of paper fluttered to the floor. The sight of it sent a jolt of panic through her system. The letter. After all these years, how could she have been so careless as to keep it? She reached down, fingers closing around the yellowed paper just as the service bell chimed. Startled, she hastily shoved the letter beneath a stack of invoices rather than returning it to its hiding place in the book. This small decision, seemingly inconsequential, would be the first in a chain that would unravel everything she had built. "Hello?" a voice called from the front. "Anyone here?" Margaret smoothed her apron and hair before emerging from the office. A young woman with copper-colored hair twisted into a practical bun stood at the counter, dressed in the plain uniform of the town's domestic service agency. "I'm Lily Crawford," the woman said, extending a hand. "The agency sent me. You requested cleaning help 3 times weekly?" Margaret had forgotten the arrangement, made weeks ago when business was booming. "Yes, of course," she said, taking the girl's hand briefly. "Though I'm not sure I still need—" "It's all been paid through the month," Lily said with a smile that crinkled the corners of her eyes. "And I don't mind if business is slow. Gives me a chance to do a proper job." There was something disarming about her directness. Margaret found herself nodding. "Very well, you can start in the kitchen. I just need to—" She gestured vaguely toward the front door, suddenly desperate for fresh air. Outside, the spring afternoon carried the scent of approaching rain, the real kind, not the artificial mist she created in her baking. Margaret drew a deep breath, willing her heart to stop its frantic pounding. The newspaper article was just bad luck, she told herself. It would blow over, people would remember how much they loved her pastries, and the whispers would die down. A reflection in the bakery window caught her attention, a man in a crisp white shirt, standing across the street, watching her. For a moment, their eyes met in the glass, and a shock of recognition nearly caused her knees to buckle. It couldn't be. Not here, not now. When she spun around, the spot where he had stood was empty. Margaret pressed a hand to her throat, feeling the rapid flutter of her pulse. The town clock from the square chimed once for 1/2 past the hour. 1:30. Had she imagined him? Back inside, Lily was already making remarkable progress. The stainless steel surfaces gleamed, and the girl was humming softly as she worked, some hymn that Margaret vaguely recognized from childhood. "You have a lovely shop," Lily commented as Margaret checked the display cases. "I especially like that old clock. Keeps perfect time, doesn't it?" The ornate wall clock had been there when Margaret leased the space, a fixture she'd been told she couldn't remove. Its steady ticking had become so much a part of her daily rhythm that she hardly noticed it anymore. Yes, I suppose it does. As Margaret began preparing dough for tomorrow's baking, habits were important, especially when one's world was tilting. She found herself watching Lily. There was something genuine about the girl, an openness that Margaret had trained herself to be wary of. People who showed you everything often expected the same in return. "Where are you from originally, Mrs. Winters?" Lily asked as she carefully wiped down the wooden shelving behind the counter. Margaret's hands stilled in the dough. "Up north," she replied, the vagueness deliberate. "A small town. You wouldn't know it." "I've always lived here," Lily said, seemingly unaware of Margaret's discomfort. "Never even been to the capital. One day, though." She stepped back to admire her work, then reached into her pocket. "Almost forgot. I found this while dusting your office shelves." In her outstretched palm sat a small wooden cross, no bigger than a playing card, intricately carved with vine patterns around its edges. Margaret stared at it, uncomprehending. "It was tucked behind some recipe books," Lily explained. "Looked like it might be important to someone." Margaret had never seen the cross before. It must have been left by the previous tenant, hidden away and forgotten. "It's not mine," she said, turning back to her dough. Lily set it on the counter near Margaret's workspace. "Well, maybe it's meant to find you anyway. My grandmother always said objects like this have a way of finding the people who need them." With that cryptic statement, she returned to her cleaning. When Lily left at 4 o'clock, Margaret found herself oddly reluctant to see her go. The girl had brought a lightness to the heavy atmosphere of the day. The cross remained on the counter where Lily had left it. Margaret picked it up, running her thumb over the smooth wood. On its back, someone had burned a single word: Grace. She placed it on the shelf behind the register, telling herself she would throw it away tomorrow. That night, as she locked up the shop, the familiar sense of someone watching prickled at the back of her neck. The street was quiet, most businesses already closed, but a shadow moved in the alleyway beside the bakery. Margaret quickened her pace toward her car, fumbling with her keys. "Margaret," a voice called softly, a voice she had hoped never to hear again. The man from the reflection stepped into the pool of light cast by the street lamp. Older now, lines etched deeply around his mouth and eyes, but unmistakably Richard Blackwood. The white shirt he wore was expensive but rumpled, as though he'd been traveling. His presence here in this town where she'd hidden herself away was impossible. And yet, "How did you find me?" The words escaped as barely more than a whisper. Richard's smile never reached his eyes. "Did you really think you could disappear so completely? After what happened?" He moved closer, and Margaret fought the urge to back away. "You've done well for yourself. Respected business owner, pillar of the community. Until today's paper, that is. What do you want?" The question emerged stronger than she felt. "Just a conversation, for old time's sake." He gestured toward the bakery. Perhaps inside. The thought of him entering her sanctuary made her stomach turn, but the alternative, standing exposed on the street, seemed worse. With shaking hands, she unlocked the door. Inside, the bakery was transformed by night, shapes familiar by day, now looming in shadow. Margaret switched on only the small lamp above the register, casting everything in a warm, amber glow. The clock ticked relentlessly. 8:12. "Quaint," Richard commented, running a finger along the counter. "Very different from the life you left behind." "I didn't leave," Margaret corrected, keeping the counter between them. "I escaped." "Semantics." He shrugged, his gaze wandering to the shelves behind her. "What an interesting piece," he said, reaching past her to take the wooden cross. "Found religion in your new life?" Margaret snatched it back, surprising herself with the protective gesture. "What do you want, Richard?" He studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. "I need money." A bitter laugh escaped her. "Of course you do. $10,000. Then I'll disappear just like you did." "I don't have that kind of money." "Don't insult me, Margaret. This place," he gestured around the bakery, "has been successful for years. You have it." She did, in fact. Not in her checking account, but in a safety deposit box at the bank, her emergency fund, her security. "And if I refuse?" Richard's smile turned cold. "Then I think the good people of this town would be very interested to learn exactly who has been feeding their children the real Margaret Winters, or should I say, Annabel Porter." The sound of her real name struck like a physical blow. She hadn't heard it spoken aloud in 7 years. "You wouldn't. We both know exactly what I'm capable of." He placed a business card on the counter. "Tomorrow, bring the money to this address, noon." With one last lingering look around the bakery, he left, the bell above the door jingling with incongruous cheerfulness. Margaret sank to the floor behind the counter, drawing her knees to her chest. The clock's ticking seemed to grow louder in the silence. 8:23. Her fingers closed around the wooden cross, squeezing until the edges bit into her palm. Sleep eluded her that night. Memories she'd suppressed for years now bubbling to the surface like poison. The bank job had been Richard's idea. A simple in and out, he'd said. No one would get hurt. But then the security guard had appeared and Richard had panicked. The gunshot still echoed in her nightmares. She hadn't pulled the trigger, but she'd been there. An accomplice. And after, when they'd split up to avoid capture, she'd taken her share of the money and created a new identity. A new life. Richard had been caught. She had assumed he was still in prison, would be for decades. How had he found her? How had he gotten out? Morning brought no clarity, only the leaden certainty that her life here was over. She opened the bakery on autopilot, though she expected no customers. To her surprise, a few regulars trickled in, their curiosity about the newspaper article apparently stronger than their suspicion. Margaret served them mechanically, her mind occupied with the problem of Richard. At 10:30, Lily arrived, her presence an unwelcome complication to Margaret's spiraling thoughts. "You look like you haven't slept," the younger woman observed, hanging up her coat. "Bad night?" "Something like that." Margaret checked the clock. 10:32. Less than 2 hours until she was supposed to meet Richard. "Would you like me to mind the front while you rest?" Lily offered. "I worked at a cafe during school. I know my way around a register." The unexpected kindness nearly undid her. "No, I have an errand to run soon, but thank you." Lily nodded and began her cleaning routine, filling the silence with occasional humming. The familiar hymn twisted something in Margaret's chest, a remnant of a faith abandoned long ago, when prayers for forgiveness had gone unanswered. At 11:15, Margaret removed $10,000 from the safe hidden beneath the floorboards of her office. Not all of her emergency fund, but most of it. The money felt dirty in her hands, tainted by its origins and now by its destination. As she placed it in an envelope, her gaze fell on the letter she'd hastily hidden the day before. On impulse, she tucked it into her pocket alongside the envelope. "I'll be back in an hour," she told Lily, who was arranging fresh flowers in a vase by the window. Flowers Margaret hadn't even noticed the girl had brought. "Take your time," Lily replied with a smile. "Everything's under control here." The address Richard had provided led to a rundown motel on the outskirts of town. Margaret parked at the far end of the lot, her stomach churning with dread. Roommates' curtains were drawn, but she could see the shadow of movement behind them. She sat in her car, the envelope heavy in her lap, watching the digital clock on her dashboard. 11:57, 11:58, 11:59. As the clock turned to 12, she reached for her door handle and froze. What was she doing? Paying him would solve nothing. He would come back for more, again and again, until she had nothing left, and then he would expose her anyway, out of spite or boredom or simply because it was in his nature to destroy. The scent of rain-soaked earth filled the car as a spring shower began, droplets pattering against the windshield. Margaret's fingers found the wooden cross she'd impulsively slipped into her pocket alongside the money. No one ever dared to imagine that the bakery owner's past was so dark until the maid asked. The thought came unbidden, as though the words had been waiting in her subconscious. She'd built a life on lies, and now it was collapsing around her. A sharp rap on her window startled her from her thoughts. Richard stood in the rain, his white shirt already soaked through, his expression thunderous. Margaret lowered the window a crack. "You're late," he snapped. "I'm not coming in," she replied, surprised by the steadiness of her voice. "Here." She thrust the envelope through the opening. Richard counted the money with swift efficiency, then smiled, all charm again. "Smart decision. I'll be in touch if I need more." "No," Margaret said, "this is it. If you come back, I'll go to the police myself." His laugh was genuine, if cold. "And tell them what? That the woman who helped rob a bank and fled the scene of a murder is being blackmailed? That would be a fascinating conversation." "I've changed," she insisted. "I'm not that person anymore." "People like us don't change, Margaret. We just get better at pretending." He pocketed the money and walked away, leaving her shaking in the driver's seat. The drive back to the bakery passed in a blur. The clock on the dashboard read 1:27 when she parked behind the building. The rain had stopped, leaving the air heavy with moisture and the peculiar scent of wet asphalt that always reminded Margaret of new beginnings. Inside, the bakery was empty of customers, but Lily had transformed the space. Every surface gleamed, the display cases were artfully rearranged, and the copper pots hanging above the workspace shone like new money. "There was a rush while you were gone," Lily said proudly. "Sold almost everything. I wrote down the orders." She pushed a notepad toward Margaret. "People were asking specifically for your cinnamon rolls and that sourdough with the special crust." Margaret stared at the list of orders, unable to comprehend this sudden reversal of fortune. "Why?" Lily's expression turned sheepish. "Well, I might have mentioned to Mrs. Peterson, you know, the mayor's wife, that the newspaper article was a vindictive piece written by a critic you once turned down for a date. And Mrs. Peterson might have mentioned it to her book club, and they might have decided to organize a show of support." "You lied for me." The irony wasn't lost on Margaret. "Why would you do that?" Lily shrugged, turning away to adjust an already perfect display. "You seemed like you needed a win. And anyway, I don't think it was the whole truth, whatever's in that article, but I don't think it's as bad as they made it sound either." She glanced at the clock. 1:39. "Your past is your business." The words, offered so casually, struck at something fundamental in Margaret's carefully constructed defenses. Her fingers found the cross in her pocket, tracing its edges. "Lily," she began, uncertain why she suddenly wanted to unburden herself to this near stranger. "What if it was worse than they imagined?" Lily turned, her expression serious for the first time since Margaret had met her. "Then it would still be between you and God." The clock ticked 7 times before Margaret found her voice again. "I don't believe in God, not anymore." "That's okay," Lily said with a small smile. "He believes in you." The rest of the afternoon passed in a haze of unexpected business. Word had indeed spread, and the bakery saw more customers than it had in weeks. Margaret moved through it all mechanically, her mind still at the motel, still on Richard's promise to return, still on the burden of her past that grew heavier rather than lighter with each passing year. At closing time, as Lily gathered her things to leave, Margaret found herself saying, "Would you like to stay for coffee? I could use the company." If Lily was surprised by the invitation, she didn't show it. "I'd like that." They sat at the small table in the corner of the bakery, steam rising from their mugs, the tick of the clock marking the silence between them. 5:43. Outside, the light was fading, casting long shadows across the wooden floor. "The man who came in just before closing," Margaret said finally. "Did you notice him?" Lily nodded. White shirt, expensive watch, seemed to know you. He didn't buy anything. His name is Richard. The admission felt like stepping off a cliff. He's someone from my past. Not a happy part, I'm guessing. Margaret stared into her coffee. No. Do you want to talk about it? The question hung between them, heavy with possibility. The scent of rain-soaked earth drifted through the partially open window, a spring shower having passed while they sat in silence. Margaret's hand found the wooden cross in her pocket again. I did something terrible, she whispered. A long time ago. Lily waited, her expression open and free of judgment. I was young and desperate and in love with the wrong person. We robbed a bank. The words, once released, seemed to tumble out of their own accord. A security guard was shot. He died. I didn't pull the trigger, but I was there. I ran, changed my name, started over. She couldn't look at Lily as she spoke, couldn't bear to see the horror and disgust that would inevitably fill the younger woman's eyes. The clock ticked 23 times before Lily spoke. Is that what the letter is about? The one you keep touching in your pocket? Startled, Margaret withdrew the yellowed paper. How did you... I found it when I was cleaning yesterday. It had fallen behind your desk. I didn't read it, Lily added hastily, but it seemed important. Margaret unfolded the letter with trembling fingers. 7 years, and she still knew every word by heart. It's from the security guard's daughter. She wrote to the papers after the trial. About forgiveness, her voice broke on the word. About how her father would have wanted to forgive the people who took his life. I kept it to remind myself of what I took from her, what can never be restored. May I? Lily held out her hand, and after a moment's hesitation, Margaret passed her the letter. As Lily read, her expression softened, tears gathering in the corners of her eyes. This is beautiful, she said finally, and terrible, both at once. How can you sit there, Margaret asked, knowing what I've done and not walk away? Lily carefully refolded the letter. Because everyone deserves grace. Even you. Especially you. Grace, Margaret echoed, the word feeling foreign on her tongue. She withdrew the wooden cross, placing it on the table between them. Like this. Exactly like that. Lily touched the cross gently. It was my grandmother's. I left it for you yesterday because, I don't know. You seemed like you were carrying something heavy. I thought it might help. No one ever dared to imagine that the bakery owner's past was so dark until the maid asked. The title of her own story seemed to hover in the air between them, no longer just a phrase, but the pivotal moment she now found herself in. It can't change what happened, Margaret said, pushing the cross back toward Lily. No, Lily agreed, but it can change what happens next. The bell above the door jangled, startling them both. Richard stood in the entrance, his white shirt now dry but deeply wrinkled. His eyes were wild, his movements jerky as he approached their table. We need to talk, he said to Margaret, ignoring Lily entirely. Now. We have nothing to discuss. Margaret rose, placing herself between Richard and the younger woman. I paid you. We're done. They know, Richard hissed, grabbing her arm. Someone recognized me from the old wanted posters. They're reopening the case, looking at new evidence. They'll find you, too. The floor seemed to tilt beneath Margaret's feet. What new evidence? Security footage they couldn't access before. New technology. His grip tightened painfully. We need to leave. Now. Together. Let go of her, Lily said, her voice surprisingly authoritative. She had risen and moved to Margaret's side. You're hurting her. Richard's attention snapped to Lily, seeing her properly for the first time. Stay out of this, little girl. You have no idea what you're getting involved in. I know exactly what I'm involved in, Lily replied, her calm unshaken. And I know that running won't solve anything for either of you. How touching, Richard sneered. Found yourself a moral compass, Margaret. A bit late for that, wouldn't you say? The clock ticked loudly in the tense silence. 6:02. Outside, the evening had fully descended, the bakery's interior now reflected in the darkened windows. Margaret could see the three of them, herself, Richard and Lily, like actors on a stage, playing out some divine morality tale. "I'm not running anymore," Margaret said, surprising herself with the certainty in her voice. "If they're reopening the case, then I'll face it. I'll tell them everything." "Are you insane?" Richard's grip loosened in his shock. "They'll put you away for decades." "Maybe, but it would be honest, it would be right." The words, once spoken, settled something restless in Margaret's soul. "You should do the same." Richard's laugh was harsh, bordering on hysterical. "Turn myself in, confess my sins. Is that what your little friend here has been preaching to you?" He grabbed the wooden cross from the table, holding it up mockingly. "This isn't going to save you, Margaret. Nothing can." "You're wrong," Lily said quietly, "and I think you know it, or you wouldn't be here trying to convince her to run with you. You're afraid to face this alone." Richard's composure fractured visibly, his hand shaking as he still clutched the cross. "You don't know anything about me." "I know you haven't let go of what happened any more than she has," Lily replied. "I know you've probably spent every day since then looking over your shoulder, just like she has. And I know that kind of life isn't living at all." The clock ticked 12 times. 6:03. Margaret watched a series of emotions cross Richard's face: anger, fear, and finally, something close to resignation. "They'll throw away the key," he said, his voice barely audible. "Maybe," Margaret acknowledged, "but we'll finally be free of it. Really free." Richard looked down at the wooden cross in his hand, turning it over to reveal the word burned into its back. "Grace," he read aloud, the word seeming to stick in his throat. "It's never too late," Lily said gently, "for either of you." The next morning dawned clear and bright, the air washed clean by the night's rain. Margaret stood at the bakery counter, watching the minute hand of the wall clock approach 6. In a few moments, she would unlock the doors for the day's business, though she knew it might be one of her last as a free woman. After Richard had left the previous night, alone, but with a promise to consider their conversation, Margaret had stayed up talking with Lily until the small hours. They had spoken of guilt and redemption, of justice and mercy, of the possibility that facing the consequences of one's actions might be the beginning of healing rather than the end of hope. The wooden cross now hung beside the clock, catching the morning light that streamed through the front windows. Margaret had not prayed in 7 years, but this morning she had found herself whispering words of contrition to a God she was no longer certain existed, but desperately wanted to believe in. The bell above the door jingled, startling her from her reverie. Lily entered, followed by a man Margaret had never seen before, tall, with kind eyes and an air of quiet authority. "Margaret," Lily said, her voice gentle, "this is my father. He's a lawyer. I told him a hypothetical situation about a friend who needed help turning herself in for something that happened a long time ago, something she regrets deeply." The man stepped forward, extending his hand. "Nathaniel Crawford, if you'd like, I can help you navigate what comes next. It won't be easy, but with voluntary surrender, cooperation, and the time that's passed." He let the sentence hang unfinished, offering no false promises. Margaret looked from father to daughter, understanding dawning. "You knew," she said to Lily. "Somehow you knew who I was before I told you." Lily's smile was sad, but without pity. "The letter you kept. I recognized the case. My uncle was a reporter who covered it. When I saw your name in the job assignment, I wondered. But I didn't know for certain until you confided in me." "Why help me?" Margaret asked, the question that had haunted her through the sleepless night. "After what I did?" "Because," Lily said simply, 7 years ago, a young woman wrote a letter about forgiveness that helped me through the darkest time of my life. Her words about her father's capacity for mercy changed me. I never knew if the people who needed to read it ever saw it." She gestured to the letter that now lay on the counter between them. "Until yesterday." The clock struck 6, its chime seeming to resonate through Margaret's very bones. Without thinking, her hand went to the wooden cross, fingers tracing the word carved there. "What happens now?" she asked. Nathaniel Crawford's expression was serious but not unkind. "Now we tell your story, the whole truth, and we ask for mercy, knowing it's not something we're entitled to, but something we can only receive as a gift." Richard arrived as they were preparing to leave, his face haggard from a sleepless night but somehow lighter than Margaret had ever seen it. He nodded to her, a silent acknowledgement of the decision they had both reached separately but together. As they stepped outside, the scent of rain-soaked earth rose from the warming pavement. The bakery sign swung gently in the morning breeze. Margaret paused to look back at the life she had built, the refuge that had been both sanctuary and prison. The wooden cross caught the sunlight from its new place beside the clock, sending a warm glow across the empty shop. No one ever dared to imagine that the bakery owner's past was so dark until the maid asked. The words no longer felt like an accusation, but like the beginning of a different story, one that acknowledged the darkness but didn't end there. 3 years later, the bakery reopened under new management, a work release program for women nearing the end of their sentences, supervised by a blonde woman in her 40s whose time served had been reduced in recognition of her full confession and cooperation. The rain-soaked earth scent still perfumed the sourdough, and the clock still kept perfect time. But now, beneath it hung a small wooden plaque engraved with the words that had changed everything. "Grace is not getting what you deserve. Mercy is getting what you don't." And on quiet afternoons, when the rush of customers had subsided, Margaret would sometimes find herself watching the clock, counting the seconds of a life she'd never expected to reclaim. And beside her would often stand a copper-haired woman whose question had broken open the darkness and let in the first tentative rays of light, not to expose, but to heal.